Hello, everyone, and welcome to session 3. And this is Intra-Regional and International Trade, Unlocking Opportunities for African Women. So we have a panel here today addressing questions of women and international trade. And I will just start with a little introduction of our speakers and our colleagues participating in this session, and we will welcome everyone to participate. So in terms of our speakers, our keynote will be given by Ms. Yavi Madurai, who is in the call, and she will give us a brief overview of issues. In the call as well, in terms of our panel, we have Kirti Nasai, who is the Director of Health Value Consulting and will be participating in the session. We also have Ms. Shengi Ndovu, a trade facilitation expert and the president of OWIT Zimbabwe. And we have a third speaker who has not been able to join us, which is on the program. So to set the ball rolling, I will just invite us to give the floor to Ms. Yavi Madurai, who will set the scene and let us proceed. The floor is yours, Yavi. We are very, very honored to have you join our sessions today. So welcome again.
Thank you, Rosalind. Thank you so much. It's such an honor and such a pleasure to be able to be part of the conversation. Conversations like this need to happen. There's no such word as enough when it comes to these conversations, because the more we talk about it, the more we ensure that women are included in the agenda or the economic agenda of Africa. And that is where I start today. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you for being able to come to the session today to be able to let us discuss and talk about the opportunities from a trade perspective. So I want to formally go into it, and it's a bit of a strange day for me, and I'm going to tell you why. So I greet you today from a country from the continent of Africa, because Africa is not a country, it's a continent. Others call it Africa, we call it home. I greet you from the global south, where my country and my continent has invested in genomic sequencing so advanced that we have become the first in the world as South Africa to detect variants within the COVID-19 disease, but the world cuts us off and shuts us down because they call it Africa, we call it home. I greet you from a continent that has literally birthed the future of the world in having the highest number of youth percentage. And even with statistics that show that by the year 2030, 1 in 4 of the global workforce will be from this continent. We are still treated as though we have no future because everyone calls it Africa with a level of antitrust, pity, and a tone, but we call it home. I greet you as a born continental, where women account for half of the population, are limited by the disease of patriarchy that inhabits most countries in the world today, but Africa is tainted with the brand of backwardness that is somehow different. Yet we are the only continent to be able to claim having female presidents of various countries since the mid-1900s, before feminism was even a thing. I greet you this evening from a landmass that holds 1.3 billion multiracial people called Africans, who are so gentle in spirit and giving in nature that 54 of the 55 countries of Africa were colonized and divided by intention, making progress after the end of colonization almost impossible. And finally, I greet you from the continent where global history is made continuously. But the world doesn't necessarily hear about it because it's Africa. 11 months ago, a single such event occurred that the world has heard about, but are cautiously approaching it because if you know, then you'll know. The world may call us Africa, but we call it home. And as such, we are investing We are building, we are repositioning, and we are redefining what it means to be African. And the African Continental Free Trade Area, or the AFCFTA, is allowing us to do just that. The largest free trade area outside of the WTO exists, and it exists in Africa. At full potential, it has the capacity to realize $3.6 trillion, lifting 30 million people out of poverty. For the first time in the history of Africa, we have something that can be considered a watershed moment. There is much debate about our state of delusion in that the AFCFTA will become yet another African Union project that is never implemented. I'm here today to tell you that it will be implemented. But what are the opportunities for women across the continent and globally? The AFCFTA, in my opinion, if nothing else, is a revolution for women, because 70% of the informal sector of Africa are women. Formalization of Africa's informal economy is the first step to operationalizing the AFCFTA and making it a success. And therefore, it will be implemented. The Women in Trade Protocol has been our go-to point to turn the tide and ensure that women are included in the economic and trade agenda of the African continent, whether by request or demand, because unfortunately, the AFCFTA, as it stands today before the various protocols were put in place, has been gender and youth blind. Women of the continent have the opportunity to make the AFCFTA theirs. At PUBWA, we like to say the AFCFTA is ours. And as such, we will take ownership, we will take responsibility, and we will take accountability for its success. In working with and partnering with the AFCFTA Secretariat, there have been many discussions, as you can imagine, with regard to how will this be implemented. 55 or 54, because Eritrea has not signed, 54 states have to let go, shall we say, of their individual trade agreements. And trade liberalization can only happen for Africa if 54 come together and ensure that we have one trade agreement that allows us. African unity was the dream of our forefathers, and today that dream is realized from an economic agenda perspective, not just from the perspective of, it's a dream. It's a true dream in terms of being able to unite Africa. Peace and security is something that we all know is an issue across our borders and within the constraints of the continent. With trade and under the AFCFTA, one of the lovely unintended consequences is that when you trade with each other, you do not fight with each other. So peace and security, one of our biggest goals on the continent, as engendered in Agenda 2063, will and should come about. Having said all of this, it is going to be a long journey. His Excellency Wamkele Mene always says, this is not going to be easy. It is going to be difficult, but it has to be done. So with all of us that are part and parcel and making a contribution in some way towards the AFCFTA's success, we know the responsibility and the understanding of what that means. And I'm sure my fellow panelists, as we unpack today's panel discussion, will allude to that. We know the difficulties. We understand that and I always say, in my lifetime, I may not see the full effect or the full success of the AFCFTA. And that's okay, because we are doing it for the future generations of Africa. Those same people that are going to be or are the future of the world. So on that note, let us talk about the AFCFTA from an opportunities perspective and in terms of how that looks from an operationalization, but also how do we make it tangible and we make it meaningful. You can't say $3.6 trillion or 30 million people out of poverty. Who are those people? Where is that $3.6 trillion going to go to? We need to make it real. We need to make it action-based, and we have to start speaking directly to the people who it is going to matter to the most.
Thank you very much, Yavi, for that very rousing opening. And it's clear here that your passion for Africa, your passion for women, your passion for trade and economic empowerment is almost palpable here. And Yavi, as the founder and executive director of the Pan-African Women's Business Association, brings in some very, very informed insights into this debate. And as you highlight, the African Continent Free Trade Area presents certain possibilities for us. So I'm going to open the discussion by posing a question to Ms. Shengi Ndlovu, who is the president of OWIT Zimbabwe, in the same line. So Shengi, welcome very much to our panel. And a question here for you: how can trade agreements such as the African Continent Free Trade Area Agreement better reflect gender and better work for women in your experience? Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalind. The AfCFTA, I must mention, is not the first agreement to be signed. We are excited about the AfCFTA. Let me just first be clear on that. We are excited, and our excitement is actually reflected in the way our leaders have actually facilitated this agreement, which has been concluded in record time. The political will to achieve, to implement is high, and so it is with amongst the grassroots people. But what actually maybe gives us some uncertainty or some fear, if I may say, as I said, it is not the first agreement. And most agreements, most trade agreements in the past have been signed and they had gender clauses. But how is it, as Yavi said, we have got about 70% of women in informal trade, and they've remained informalized. And again, when you look at their counterparts don't take time to actually escalate, to upscale and become formal businesses. If you look at the statistics of the McKinsey Company report, it said about 14%, with 14% of micro businesses which are registered, and 2% of SMEs which are also registered. Actually, the division is between the micro and the SMEs. 14% are micro and SMEs are 2%. Those are registered. And the unregistered, we've got 82% of micro businesses that are not registered. And we've got 2% SMEs. And this information is from the Africa Development Bank, not the McKinsey company. What I'm trying to allude here is, yes, we've got a trade agreement. How is it going to work for this time around for women? And also, we do this against the hindsight that research says with most trade agreements, they tend to benefit the multinationals. They tend to benefit your big corporations, still big guys that benefit. So we are also worried that the AfCFTA may actually be maybe something, a non-event for the small people, for the MSMEs. But then what has it done this time around that is going to make it different, that is going to set it aside, that is going to separate from the usual trade agreements? One, the African trade agreement, the AfCFTA has actually preambled gender inclusivity. If you go to section 3E of the AfCFTA, you find that they talk about the socio-economic inclusion, where their thrust is not to leave anyone behind. But as women, because once bitten, twice shy, we know the history of trade agreements, that they are there to benefit the people out there, the big corporates out there, the big guys out there. Then we lobbied again that can't we have a dedicated chapter to for the women, so that the women benefit, so that everything can be monitored. And what has happened is through their political commitment, they have actually now, as Yavi said, we've got now a women and youth protocol in the AfCFTA. This separate instrument has actually solicited a lot of input from the grassroots women. Unlike the AfCFTA, a lot of it just came as a surprise. There were no consultations, but at the same time, we cannot bemoan that we're not involved as women. When after all, we have now this separate protocol, which is currently under negotiation of what we want it to become to us. And we've had several consultations involving grassroots people on how they want to be involved and how they want this trade agreement to deliver on them. So how is it going to work for women? What is being done? What has been done is actually maybe to first identify in the first instance why the women have not benefited from the trade agreements that have been there before. When we look at the international arena in itself, it's not maybe we cannot romanticize international trade. It has got its own challenges. But then this time with the AfCFTA, we are speaking about intra-trade Africa, meaning that when we had challenges to actually break into the international markets, but now we've got this platform now where we are going to trade amongst ourselves within the 54 countries. What is it that is going to be done this time around? What is it that is going to make it easy for women to trade? You find that we still have the same challenges that are affecting international trade, affecting intra-Africa regional trade. And what are those challenges? The first challenge is that the information on trade, the information on trade is scarce. Whenever it is available, that information is very technical. And the procedures themselves are fragmented. Never mind that the 54 countries and their economies they are not at the same level. The fragmented economies within Africa are not at the same level. But that is not to say we are discouraged. Actually, what we are doing, we're actually positioning our women's organizations to overcome those impediments, to overcome those barriers, be it an economy that is maybe is not at the same level. And what the FCFTA has done also is to actually work with countries. The provisions are not ad hoc that you adopt or leave, but countries have to actually design their tariff offers. By tariff offers, it means that countries have got about 15 years to phase down, to liberalize their tariffs. And that is going to be done according to what is prevailing in the country. And we have organizations that have come, international agencies that have actually come and helped to actually unpack those tariffs, whereby women can actually find low entry barriers to those commodities. And it is us now as women's organizations to go and to our ministries and find out the sort of goods that are going to be what are going to actually offer the low hanging fruits for those for us to embark on trading. And then once these goods have been identified, the next step becomes the area of harmonization of the procedures, because the trade itself is trade law, if I may say, has got a lot of jargon, and to the ordinary person that is usually intimidating. And what we are lobbying is for simplification of procedures and harmonization of those procedures across countries. And how is that going to be done? The first port of call, as we know, the AfCFTA is hinged on the national export strategy. If our women are going to export, they need to be familiar with what happens within the export terrain. We know that when you are talking about exports, you are talking about the technical barriers to trade. We are talking about your standardization. We are talking about certification. We are talking about phytosanitary standards as well. All those are actually come with high compliance costs. So what do our women do in order to actually maybe find that they can actually comply with what is required? Because that cannot be waived. We know the benefits of actually complying with the TPTs and your phytosanitary standards is for our health, for our safety, for the consumers. So the only way for us, for our women to actually maybe enjoy those markets that will be coming with the AfCFTA is for capacity building in those areas. And capacity building in those areas should be done actually with maybe a country that has, where a market is identified. We have to have this affirmative that our women, we should create the appetite to learn. And also on the other hand, we speak to our customs officers as well. We also need the capacity to know how to approach to entreat these women traders, because also you find that they are stereotyped. The mindset towards the women in trade is different from when you compare it to the mindset towards the corporate sector. So what we are saying is, on the one side, we are building capacity in our women traders. On the other side, we're also building capacity in our customs officers as well. And then we also approach, as both entities, we approach our government to enable the environment. How does the government enable the environment? To start us, like if I'm speaking about my country, our country is actually a signatory to the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. And we have also lobbied for the notifications to be sent to the WTO such that our women, the trading field is enabled, and all those fragmented procedures, customs procedures are actually harmonized. And on the center of it, it is the rules of origin. I'm not going to put the participants on what entails the rules of origin. Rules of origin remain complex. And just as much as I have said, they can also not be wished away because they are there to protect the AfCFTA from third parties enjoying the AfCFTA. But then for the ordinary woman, they might not understand. We know there's the HTR, the Simplified Trade Regime, of which we are also building capacity in our women so that they are able to participate in the trade. But then with the STR, it has got its own challenges because it has got certain thresholds. And by its nature, it's limiting. And we are saying we want our women not to actually be Mickey Mouse traders. We want them to be to participate in the main arena of trade. And by us encouraging them to actually adopt and take up the STR, it becomes a platform, it becomes a means to actually venturing into the international markets. So as such, as OWEI Zimbabwe as well, what we've also been doing is to actually maybe talk much, amplify our voices with coming together with other women organizations to amplify our voice about the gender-specific trade facilitation reform, which mostly it will call for the analysis of value chains, where those value chains can be identified as gender entry points. We're not going to talk about value addition, about value chains without identifying the level at which our women can actually join those value chains and be effective international traders or intra-Africa regional traders. So what I'm going to say in short, Rosalind, in conclusion, is that the AfCFTA has got the low-hanging fruits, and each country has been tasked to actually offer the tariff lines, and it's up to nationals within those countries to approach their ministries to find out which goods which goods can they readily trade in, so that they enjoy the comparative advantage that has been actually been identified by the trade analyst. So in that situation, they've got a ready basket where they can choose from whether they pick up a particular export and value add it, and they are ready to go using the STR. And with those who are already into we are trading as big corporates, the certificate of origin is going to be simplified in terms of the ministry building capacities in navigating and ensuring them that they are registered to actually trade under preference and enjoy the reduced rates of duties. Maybe for now, I can just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shengi, as the president of OWEI Zimbabwe and as a very, very experienced colleague on the ground. You have really pushed for this inclusion of grassroots women within the AfCFTA, and you have presented us quite a few issues to think about and to unpack. You highlight the role of business environments, and you highlight the role of barriers, and some of these link very well with part of the work that Kirti has been doing. And so I'm just going to invite Kirti Nasai to speak to us. Now, Kirti, as the MD of Health Value Consulting, and additionally as a researcher, you've done quite a bit of work on how to include women within specific value chains. And I know you've done quite a lot of research around African business environments. So I'd really like you to give us an insight as to how we can help women enter and thrive within either specific value chains or take opportunity of the African continent free trade area. You're very welcome, Kirti.
Thank you, Rosalind, and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this panel. I think it's such an important conversation and very timely. I also want to thank the previous speakers on some of the very important points that they've raised. So one of the things that I was doing in terms of preparation for this panel conversation is looking at some statistics, right? And I think Yavi mentioned that 70% of trade in Africa is conducted by women. So we are a significant, powerful force on the continent when it comes to trade. There's some other statistics that I can share, and that is that 90% of the labor force in the informal sector are women. 70% of the labor force in the agricultural sector are also women. And I actually attended another summit called the EU Africa Summit, where they were talking about this agricultural sector. And one of the things that disappointed me was the lack of representation of women from Africa in that conversation, considering the statistic that I've just shared with you. One of the things that we have to ask ourselves is, do we have a voice in these important forums? And how do we actually get to that point where we do have a voice in all of these conversations, where we don't have people outside of who don't necessarily understand the context of women in Africa having the conversations that we should be having. And I think today's forum is an important step in the right direction in terms of the dialogue. The other area that I'm passionate about, which you mentioned, I come from the healthcare sector. And this is really an issue that we need to be talking about, especially in the context of the current COVID pandemic. Women are disproportionately impacted by healthcare issues, be it access to healthcare services and products because of transport and mobility issues, because of responsibilities that they have beyond just being working women, whether they're informal traders or in the private sector. Most women will have additional responsibilities in terms of caregiving, in terms of parenting, etc. And all of these very practical factors are something that I feel that we need to be talking about a lot more. The previous speakers have also talked about the great policy documents that have been published and the opportunities that they represent. And I completely agree with that. However, I've been doing policy work in Africa since 2008. And I think one of the areas where we fall behind is in terms of having action plans and implementation. And implementation to a very granular level, where we're looking at practical impacts on the women that we're trying to have a positive impact on. And I think that it starts with asking very practical questions as to whether they have access to information. The fact that when we talk about women in Africa, we're not talking about a homogeneous group. We're talking about such diversity in terms of culture, in terms of the type of work that they are doing, in terms of their access to information, education, and healthcare services and other areas. So one of the key questions that we need to be asking ourselves in the context of the opportunities that are before us is, are we being inclusive of women, of all women? And are we actually educating them to the point where they are represented in the way that they should? And are the interventions that are being designed at a policy level, are they appropriate? And are they going to be able to target the right people in the right way? I think these are all important conversations that we need to be having. One statistic that I came across as well is that in a country like Ethiopia, there are 44 women's associations representing 1 million women entrepreneurs. That is just one country. And how do they collaborate with each other, and how do they come up with advocacy strategies? I think that there are very strong business associations and women's associations, but then there are others that might not have access to information and resources in terms of advocating for themselves, or even educating policymakers about what their challenges are at on the ground. So one of the things that I would really like us to focus on and stress is that we need to be looking at how do we get to that very practical implementation point, and how do we measure our success? I think that's also another area where we don't always do very well, is in terms of monitoring and evaluating what progress we are making, and also being agile in terms of challenges that we may come across in terms of implementation, and then adapting to external environmental challenges, to changing needs of our constituencies, etc. And then coming back to the whole issue of healthcare, I think, this is an issue that is so close to my heart, because I have been working in the healthcare sector in Africa for a very, very long time. And even though we've had a lot of progress in some areas, there are other areas where we still are dealing with high levels of maternal and infant mortality, where we haven't been able to reach our targets. And again, there we need to be asking questions as to why. What are the challenges that women are facing in terms of access to healthcare? Because, if they are not physically and mentally well, they are not going to necessarily be able to be economically active, be it in trade or even operating within their own markets. So this is a very important point and factor that we need to be considered, because there's a direct link between healthcare and economic activity. So I am very encouraged with the Secretary General's big focus on action and implementation in relatively short timeframes. I think that it challenges us to think about how we're going to make that happen. And I'm hoping that coming out of this forum, we will be able to come up with some tangible areas where we as individuals, but also as members of other organizations, can start taking this forward, because I believe that each of us as women leaders already have a responsibility to our fellow African women to take them with us on this journey of opportunity. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Rosalind.
Thank you very much, Kirti, for some very thought-provoking comments there. You highlight the diversity of women on the African continent. It's not a homogeneous group. And you get straight to the point about the agency, the lack of agency, the lack of representation of women in the decision-making processes in terms of international trade. A very pertinent point that you've highlighted here, which I'm going to be posing to Yavi very briefly, is the question of how to monitor and evaluate the progress of women within international trade. And I will just pose a question to Yavi here, particularly in view of the very detailed insights she has into the African continent free trade area. Yavi, what is your view on the recent addition of the AFCTA protocol on women and youth? Do you think this might be a way to help us monitor and evaluate progress? Are you skeptical or are you optimistic about its potential to help women excel in international trade?
Thank you, Rosalind. Nothing works unless you do / we do, right? That is the adage that goes. It's an age-old adage, and that's exactly the point. Kirti made, and so did the lady from Zimbabwe, is that we have got trade policies. We have had women included in trade policies, let alone trade policies. We've had declarations we have had, we could be here for another hour talking about all the things that women are technically included in when it comes to documentation and policy. Creating an enabling environment out of that policy, actioning it, implementing it, is where we fall short. And I'm going to use a nice word, and I'm going to say that it's elusive, but we all know that it's not necessarily elusive. It is actually intentional in some cases, and it has been for many years. So when I said nothing works unless we do, we have got to be able to stop talking and putting things in place. So we've got to focus on action. We've got to focus on implementation. Kirti made the point, and she said words that literally my hair stood on end, because I'm so glad that another woman has said it, because we don't necessarily say it. I don't know why. Is that we need to monitor and evaluate and not be afraid of the political agenda that may work against us in that monitoring and evaluation, because unfortunately that's when things start to fall apart. So we've got to focus on it. And I'm not one for talk in terms of, say this and, we can do this and we have to do this, but without doing it. So we've actually started the barometer or the index in terms of, so I don't know if you know, but in the year 2020, the same year that the AFCFTA was launched, the year that we had enough signatures to be able to say, right now it's fine, we can go ahead with the AFCFTA. In 2020, the decade of African women's financial and economic inclusion was declared by the African Union, actually by the new AU chair, which was South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa. The previous decade was called the AWD, 2010 to 2020. What was the result of the previous decade? I'm just giving you an example. What was the result of the previous women's decade? 0.00000. They didn't even do a report because there was nothing to report. So therein lies the issues, and we can delve into why and how and all of those kind of things. But at the end of the day, you can have all of these policies, declarations, but if an enabling environment is not created, and we are waiting for permission to create that enabling environment, whereas we have to do it, unfortunately, ourselves. So we have started, I've had discussions from a PubWA perspective in terms of the African Union. Actually, I'm flying out tomorrow morning to be able to now start putting indexes in place, monitoring and evaluation with regard to the African Women's Decade 2020 to 2030. Part of that is the AFCFTA that, we believe as PubWA is part of our DNA. It's the reason why we exist. So part of that is obviously then, once it becomes operationalized, is to say, here's the protocol. The protocol has got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I'm oversimplifying it, so please just bear with me because we don't have the time or the luxury of time for me to go into the detail. But it's got, 10 things, let's say, that need to be incorporated, adjusted, implemented, re-rolled out, whatever the word is. These are the things that we are now going to add on as an annexure or an addendum to the barometer that we are using for the 2020 to 2030 decade of African women's economic and financial inclusion, so that we've got something. We are fully aware, and there is no woman on this panel today that works within the context of civil society or in the context of certain structures that will say to me that it's going to be easy. They're probably laughing at me as I'm saying this. Because it's not going to be easy to say to a president or a head of state, we need results from your country in terms of how many women are represented in cabinet, how many women, what is the percentage of public procurement for women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We know it's not going to be easy, but by the same token, we have to start, because if we don't start, we are not going to get anywhere. So to answer your question, and I'm sorry I took such a scenic route to answer your question, it's not as simple as being able to say, yes, no, are we positive about it? We have to put our heads down. The time for strategic, opportunity and some of the things that I spoke about in the keynote is lovely and it's beautiful, but we have to make it work, which means that we've got to get our hands dirty. We've got to put our knees to the grindstone, so to speak, and make it move. Because if we don't do it, who is going to?
excellent challenge posed to us, Yavi, there. And looking at the protocol that you have highlighted by the Pan-African Women, Business Women's Association, and in terms of this barometer, I would like to also link to some of the work being carried out by the Organization for Women in International Trade Zimbabwe, where Shengi is the president. Shengi, I'm aware that you are undertaking a monitoring project for the South African development community relating specifically to your work around women exporters and cross-border trade. So taking the challenge that's been posed to us there by Yavi, what are the main opportunities that you see to actually get our hands dirty and support women traders to thrive in international trade within the context of the AFCTA? Shengi?
Yes, thank you, Rosalind.
Welcome.
Yes, the main opportunities which we see for our women in cross-border trade and women in general in the corporate world is that the AFCFTA is going to come with this huge market that we talk about, a 1.3 billion market. Yes, and then we also talk about the AFCFTA is going to come up with your economies of scale. It's also going to come up with a comparative advantage. But I must hasten to say, these are not really, I don't want, like, women are usually associated with Cinderella actions or Cinderella promises that we tend to run with issues without digging deep into those issues. When I'm talking about those things that I've just listed, your economies of scale, comparative advantage or competitive advantage, or what we must know is that we haven't really concluded the protocol on free movement of people. But however, your question insists that I actually highlight the opportunities. Then what is there as well is about the liberalization of the tariffs, because one of the stumbling blocks had been the tariffs. Once the tariffs are liberalized, it means that business across borders is going to be easy, but also as a trade practitioner, that comes with its own tag. And I don't like taking women like on a Cinderella walk, if I may say that way, put it that way, that as soon as our government forfeits the revenues from the tariffs, the people who are going to suffer most, the people who are those people who are consumers of public services. When states do suffer in terms of revenue, when their coffers are going to be depleted because of lack of revenue from tariffs, we know that the first part of call they are going to cut is public expenditure. But that's not to discourage us from embracing the ACFTA. We know that revenues that come from the removal of non-tariff barriers far exceed the revenues that come from tariffs. But however, it is also important to note that the revenue from tariffs is easy to collect. That's why it has always been attractive for countries to actually use tariffs as the source of revenue. Now, the other opportunity is the issue of the exports. Because already, like in my country, in Zimbabwe, there's the National Development Strategy that is hinged on the turnaround of economy through the exports. And because of that, we are also into the drive whereby we are encouraging our women to actually identify those exports. And when we look at this, we look at the agricultural sector that is actually readily it's got maybe reduced challenges in terms of the manufacturing side of things. Remember, the FCA as well, it is there to create jobs. It is these opportunities. We're looking at our women exporters in actually expanding the value chains, in participating in those value chains, that jobs are going to be created. And once jobs are created, we're looking at our women actually maybe being participating in the job markets. And what the FCFTA is going to come up with is our what we call FDI, which usually comes with the special economic zones, which are also a big talk. The special economic zones usually offer that window where women get to have formal employment. And once women have that formal employment, it becomes dignified. But also each opportunity, I'm afraid, has got maybe its downside. So when we're talking about opportunities, it's always important for us to also highlight the downside. Our special economic zones, it's on record when they come, when the FTA comes, they usually participate in what we call the race to the bottom. And the race to the bottom means that each country has to offer the lowest in terms of packages to attract the FDI. And in such instances, they do have the tax holidays to start with. Those tax holidays also hit on the fiscus. And as far as employment of women is concerned, we have seen that our women at times get employed because of the attributes they have. We are not lamenting about them being employed for their nimble fingers, that they've got nimble fingers and they are good at doing repetitive tasks. But all we're going to watch out for is that they are paid a reasonable wage that it's reflected in that particular role they will be playing, because we know through research that women in export processing zones, they become sources of cheap labor. And the FCFTA is going to come with the special economic zones, where our women are going to, maybe some for the first time, are going to be involved in formal employment. But we are also saying we will be watching closely that as soon as they enjoy the benefits of having formal employment, they are not exploited. We know that when people are driving the export agendas, they need to drive down the export prices. And we let not be the woman who is actually supposed to be the source of the competitive advantage that would be pursued by companies. We also see the FCFTA bringing the opportunity if ever the freedom or the protocol of free movement of people is addressed. And I'm afraid the pace in that area is very slow. And it is such areas whereby at times you tend to pause and sober up and sit up. That what are we talking about? When we're talking about the FCFTA, we're talking about free borders. And yet when it comes to free movement of people, we're still having this, we are slow in actually seeing to it that free movement of people is actually maybe enhanced. And more so, the protocol of free movement of people is not even integral in the CFTA agreement. So what are we saying? What are we saying? Yes, the opportunities will be there, but in order for trade, for movement of goods, movement of services to actually be enhanced, and for those opportunities to deliver in the way that we are describing, in the way that we are perceiving that from the agreement, the free movement of people has to also be accelerated.
Thank you very much for that insight there, Shengi. As you highlight, some opportunities brought about by the AFCFTA, but then we have the potential downsides, the potential risks of creating of bad jobs or exploitative jobs. And as you highlight, the structural barriers remain. I would like to link this to a point that was raised earlier regarding, by Kurti, regarding the inclusivity of women, how we can try and get women involved within value chains or sectors where they are underrepresented and not necessarily just have to be stuck in the export zones where exploitative work and low pay prevail. And I like the fact that you highlighted the thesis of the nimble fingers and women being only trapped in particular types of work based on female attributes. So I'm going to pass this question now to Kurti just to check. Again, in a similar light, as Shengi highlighted, what do you see as some of the opportunities or downsides of women being included in sectors where they haven't previously been included before? Kurti, I will give you a minute or two just to address that
Yes.
question.
Thank you for that question, Rosalind. So the first thing that I will say is we have the talent and we have the capabilities. Yavi talked about an enabling environment, and I think the same applies to the question that you are posing to me. And one of the areas that we need to look at is access to education. So, like I mentioned earlier, I'm in the science/healthcare sector, and women are underrepresented there in terms of STEM, STEM careers and professions. And the pandemic has taught us to use technologies in ways that we haven't before, by force, right, through lockdowns and so on. But I think that we should use that opportunity as a learning point to say, how can we use this kind of technology and increase the reach that we have? For instance, in the education sector, how do we leverage technology to provide broader access to education? Another statistic that I heard earlier today is that, the average age of an African is just over 19 years old. So that is, we need to be thinking about the level of skills and technical capabilities that we're going to be creating going forward, especially when we see emerging sectors like artificial intelligence and, in the technology, other areas of the technology sector. And we've seen pockets of absolute excellence, emerging out of the African continent, not necessarily by women, but I think that tells us that we have so much of potential to come up with solutions that using technology, using science in these emerging sectors to come up with solutions to challenges that we understand much better than foreign organizations and companies and so on. But we need to focus on that enabling environment. And I think it really starts with education. Even in the healthcare sector, so Shengi mentioned the nimble fingers, but even in the healthcare sector, you find that women are, the nurses and the caregivers and so on. But they can be the surgeons, more surgeons. We have such shortage of specialized healthcare professionals on the continent, as an example. So I think that in all of our conversations, we need to be inclusive of educators and education ministries to see how gender inclusive they are and what are their focus areas and targets for including women in access to education in some of these new and emerging areas.
Excellent. A really, really thoughtful answer there, Kirti, about the role of education in informing the solutions that we come up with. As we begin to wind down the session, I will give a minute or maximum 2 minutes to the other two panel members, and I will start with Yavi, just to check. Hearing, the contributions by the panel and thinking about your work with the Pan-African Business Women's Association, as well as your role in the private sector, what possibilities exist for PABWA to work with organizations like WEI, the Women's Economic Imperative, and organizations like OWIT to try and improve and achieve these objectives for success for women in trade? Any possibilities, or would you like to see where we go from here?
No, not at all. What is it about women that is unique? We all go to the bathroom together, apparently. So in the same light, we always do things together. That's the nature of women. There's always a sisterhood in some shape or form. And that is what we need to lean into when we take on something that is it's so awesome. It is so, it's massive. We can't even begin to understand how massive it is. So in that way, we need to learn how to hold hands, as they say, and walk towards it. And it does sound a little bit, fluffy the way I'm saying it, but let me put it to you in a way that is tangible. So is there a way for us all to work together? So we're a think tank for economic transformation in Africa, specifically focused on women and youth economic and financial inclusion. And therefore, our membership is not membership. We don't have members. Our reason for existence, or our purpose in life, is to be able to create value and to be able to create information, because we are living in an age where information has become currency in the world as much as it has become currency on the continent, even more so. So we sign MOUs with various membership organizations to be able to do the work that needs to be done. When I say that, research, policy briefs, being able to put together programs and initiatives. One of the initiatives that we've put together, aside from the policy brief for the Women in Protocol, is the research study for the Decade of African Women's Economic and Financial Inclusion, the barometer. We have created the world's only trade media fellowship. The WTO is actually asking, for information, because we've got the AFCFTA Media Fellowship to ensure that there's no propaganda around our precious AFCFTA, and to be able to have journalists at the front line to be able to understand it. I'm just giving you examples of what we do with these MOUs and how we action and create a holding hands environment to be able, so membership organizations do what they do well, and we do what we do well, and together we come together to be able to create that powerhouse in order to get the things that need to be done. There's no information on the continent. We talk about 70% and 90%. It's probably reliant on, McKinsey has done some research. It's not extensive. When you go into the detail of the statistical validity, you'll find that many countries have been left out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in closing, I want to be able to have relationships from a Pabwa perspective with other women's organizations, so that we each do what we do and then come together to be powerful. The power is in the collective.
Excellent response. And thank you very much, Yavi. As you highlight there, we need to be able to hold hands and work together. And we will be getting in touch to see what we can do together. Similarly, we will be in touch as well with Zimbabwe and other channels, other sister organizations that we can work with together. I have a message here that our time is up. So what I will do now is just take a moment to thank everyone for attending the session. I would like to thank the audience, and I would also like to thank our speakers here. So thank you very much, Yavi Madurai, the president of the Pan-African Business Women's Association, for your participation. Thank you very much, Kerti Nasai, the Managing Director of Health Value Consulting, for joining us today. And thank you again, Shengin Lovu, the President of the Organization for Women in International Trade, Zimbabwe. And on behalf of my colleagues here, Dr. Margot Thomas, Noreen Cesario, and Mickey Olison, I am Rosalind Wanjero, and we are very, very pleased that you could join us today, and we will keep in touch, hold hands, and work together. Thank you. Bye, everyone.